Ghosts enter and re-enter our lexicon to explain the unexplainable, to represent the unrepresentable, to give a word to that which we don't understand. From Colin Dickey's Ghostland. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 10, and we are continuing our discussion of ghosts. So, first of all, I guess I should say for people who may be joining us at this point, this is the 3rd episode in our series of ghosts, our series on ghosts. In our first episode, we talked a bit about why ghosts, like what ghosts are, how they're interpreted in fiction and film, and why they may be scary to us. And we talked a little bit about people trying to prove whether or not ghosts exist, or different similarities that ghost stories may have that we tell. And the second episode, we talked mainly about the 2017 movie A Ghost Story, but we kind of couched that conversation within this idea of hauntings and time. So the first episode, we talked a little bit about how ghost stories developed with the idea of detective fiction. And the second episode, we talked a little bit about how ghost stories have a bit of time travel quality to them. So we started out with a quote from Doctor Who, and then we ended up talking about A Ghost Story and the Others, and how time plays a role in history because of the repetition of it. So you don't have to listen to the ghost episode in order, obviously, to understand what we're talking about this time. But if you're just now joining us and you like this episode or you're really into ghosts, that's the last 2 episodes that we have done. So in this one, we're going to be talking a bit about ghosts and history, but not just like ghosts and history in a general fact. We talked a little bit about that in the first episode. We're going to focus a little bit more in this one on how history of marginalized groups, history of groups that maybe have been ignored or pushed aside or elided in our national history, particularly women and people of color. Their stories might be kind of pushed aside, and they may burst forth through ghost stories. So these ideas of these things that as a nation we don't want to pay attention to, the treatment of women or the treatment of Native Americans or slavery or other aspects of racial violence. And it's kind of like these things are ghostly and haunting us because the traces are still there, even if people don't necessarily want to talk about it. And so a lot of writers, particularly women that will probably focus on this episode, use ghost stories in order to bring that to the fore. And before I pitch it to Lisa, because I'm interested in why you chose our particular intro, Lisa, that you read, I just want to throw out there for our listeners, if you're interested, Lisa and I wrote 2 Tor.com articles this fall, one in August on women's haunted house books, which I highly recommend. And also in October, we had an article up on Tor.com called What We Are Writing About When We Write About Ghosts. And we focused in particular on, I believe it was 5 or 6 women writers, and we talked a bit about how they, and these are writers from the late 19th, early 20th century, all the way up to today, how they use ghost stories in order to communicate a certain past or a certain experience that maybe has been ignored or pushed off to the side. So Lisa, you chose the intro for today and read it. I was just wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about why that quote particularly stood out to you. Colin Dickey's book is amazing, but I think that's a really good quote for this episode.
Yeah, I think so too. Yes, Colin Dickey's book is amazing. And I mean, Ghostland is one of my favorite just nonfiction books, just in general, but it's also one of my favorite books on ghosts because, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast in the past. I've always been interested in horror, of course. I'm doing a horror podcast. But in particular, I love ghost stories. I love when you travel to new places and, for instance, you go down, I live really close to New Orleans, And if you go to one of these like old restaurants or, old hotels or something, and if you talk to anybody who has been there before, like somebody who works there or somebody who frequents there, they immediately want to tell you about the ghost, or singular or plural, ghosts who inhabit the place. Like that is, I have found the best way, number one, to get to know the history of a place. I Mel, I know we've talked about this before. Anytime I travel, I try to take a ghost tour, because you get so much history of the place. But I'm also fascinated about why we tell the ghost stories that we tell, and I think that is what Dickey's book is so good at doing, is really looking at why particular stories have entered the public imagination. Because if we take, and we talked about this in the past two episodes, if we take the idea of ghosts at face value, then the world should, in theory, be populated by ghosts, because we should have a lot more people who have passed on than people who are living. And I guess that's why we hold tight to this idea of ghosts as having unfinished business, because we want there to be a reason why these people are hanging around. And so often it's, oh, somebody died here, under mysterious circumstances, and they're trying to, solve their own murder or something. But a lot of times I find that the ghost stories that we tell have more to do with who we are as a society and as a culture than actually the story itself. Because in the end, when you hear these ghost stories about these places that we, live and work, the places that we inhabit on a daily basis, it's not so much about whether or not that history that we're telling is true. I'm going to say true with a lowercase t, but that it actually happened. But it's more important that it's true with a capital T, that something like that could have happened. And so that's what we're telling. And so a lot of times, and this is what I'm really excited to talk about today, is that ghost stories can be a type of history where we're not bogged down with the facts, as did this person actually really exist? And did they live in this house? And did they die in the way the stories say? But that they tell us something that our traditional history is ignoring. So Mel, you mentioned, for instance, women tend to write a lot of ghost stories, and historically that has been true. And I think that's because history, in a large part, especially in the American world, history is full of men. And it's told by a lot of men, and it's told about a lot of men. And so if we want to tell the history of women, ghost stories are a safe place to do that. It's also allows us to shine a light on things that may be uncomfortable. So that's where you will start to get a lot of this marginalized voices coming through in these ghost stories, and a lot of history that history books won't tell you. So that's why I picked that that particular quote, because I think Dickey said it better and much more succinctly than I just tried to describe it. But that it takes something that we have a hard time grappling with, something that we don't maybe fully understand, or that we don't fully realize is a problem, but we can talk about it in a ghost story because it's a safe place to discuss that.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think it's scary sometimes if you pay attention to the ghost stories that we tell, how they're sometimes ghost stories are used in a way, like you were saying, to manipulate how we even think of history. In an interview Colin Dickey did with NPR, he talked in particular about when he was researching ghost stories about Richmond, Virginia. And he said almost all the stories that people would tell him, or that he found, were about white people. So there were Confederate soldiers and women who loved them, or maybe worked in brothels, or he talked about there were miners and construction workers. And he was like, there's this whole population of African Americans that are integral to this history that are not getting to be in these stories that you're being told on, say, ghost tours and in different books, which is just fascinating to me, that it's not just the person in power writes the history books, but sometimes it's the person in power even gets to tell the folklore about a place. Jessica Adams' book, Wounds of Returning, is a fascinating book about plantation history, if anybody's interested in that. But one of the things that's interesting in it is she cites studies of plantation tours and about how the vast number of stories, at least when this study was done, I believe it was in like the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of stories on plantations were just about the white family that lived there. Sometimes the places where the slaves had lived would even have been like steamrolled down, so you could just focus on the house and the belongings and how everybody was happy. And there was like this cotillion type atmosphere going on. In fact, one of the people who ran a tour said people just want the Gone with the Wind story. They don't want the real story. And I think it's really kind of scary and it's sad and it's disturbing that we even use the stories that we tell about places that may be fact or fiction, and the folklore that comes down to us through the past is also coming from the people who were in power as well. And I think that also, like when you ended up there, Lisa, talking about women and other writers using ghost stories to fight against them. I mean, that's why something like Toni Morrison's Beloved exists, or glancing over the stories that we have listed here. That's why something like Amy Tan's work exists, or Maxine Hong Kingston's work exists, because somebody needs to tell these other aspects of these stories that we're not paying attention to, or we're getting them from places and trusting those places and not getting all the information.
I'm so glad you brought up the idea of the plantation tours, because for our listeners, if you can't tell by our accents, we are Southern. We live in the South. And I remember growing up having to go on like plantation tours with like as a class field trip or something. And that was where I would get a lot of these ghost stories being told, because they would go through it, and you're right, they would focus on the Gone with the Wind aspect. Here is where everybody lived. I rarely remember hearing about slavery or seeing slave quarters or seeing anything like that on those. Of course, this would have been in like the 80s and 90s. I don't know if it has changed because I have not been on too many as an adult. But I do remember that's where I got a lot of my early ghost stories from. And a lot of them were about, well, this family, they did have a woman who used to work here in the home, and, she killed herself, and now we see her upstairs. And that was I always found that interesting, because even then that was a way of kind of acknowledging a very troublesome past, but telling it in almost a fictionalized way. And then it wasn't, of course, until, like you said, with Beloved, where Toni Morrison was just able to be like, no, we can't continue to ignore what happened. There is a collective trauma that we have to address. And that is, to this day, one of the most terrifying ghost stories I've read.
Mm-hmm. And we have to look at it from the perspective of the ghosted person. Like, you can't just put the person in a story as the person and there's a woman in your attic. I mean, I know that's not the exact story probably, but it's like, oh, there was this oh yeah, we're diverse. There was this person, and she like haunts the attic. It's like, that's not from her point of view at all, right? I mean, that's not giving
Right.
you her personal thoughts or her personal experience. And kind of like unghosting those figures and maybe like trying to look at their perspective or give them a voice is also something that these writers are trying to do. So they're not like the object of somebody's story, but they can maybe in some way like flesh out that character and give them some sort of voice or power.
Right. Well, why don't we just, jump in and talk, because we could talk around this forever. But why don't we just jump in and talk about some of these? Mel, I know you mentioned Amy Tan, and I am really anxious to talk about her because she is not often discussed in relation to horror, but she's written some pretty horrific stories.
She has, and of her work, I probably best know the Joy Luck Club, which I'm sure people are probably like, if you just know the Joy Luck Club, you're like, why are they even bringing up Amy Tan? Not that there's not maybe some hauntings going on there, but the book that I thought of in particular when we were thinking about things to talk about for this episode was her book, The Bone Setter's Daughter, which did you tell me you read that, Lisa, or is that on your you did read it, right?
No, I'm like you. I started with the Joy Luck Club and then quickly read everything I could get my hands on. And The Bone Setter's Daughter is my favorite book of hers.
I thought that you had read it. And she does some really interesting stuff in that book with the idea of haunting. I've taught The Bone Setter's Daughter many times. It's a great book. The students really get into it. It's a very emotional book, especially if you have someone in your family who is suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. But she wraps haunting into the idea of memory, but she also wraps it into the idea of history too. So, like, the mother's generation is being haunted by the memories she has of traumatic memories that she has that she's now losing and is terrified about losing. And her daughter, so she moves from China after World War II, and I believe it was during World War II, and her daughter is Chinese American, and she doesn't know anything about her mom's life in China. And so her whole life, she's been kind of traumatized by the stuff that her mom would just randomly tell her or how her mom acted, not knowing any of her mom's history. And I don't want to spoil The Bone Setter's Daughter too much, though. I feel like with something like Amy Tan or Toni Morrison, like, you can even know the plot and it's still not spoiled because it's the beauty of seeing how they do it and how they write it. But toward the beginning of the book, we realize we have the narrator, or the main character's mother, as a child in China, and she's being taken care of by this nursemaid. I can't remember what she calls her right now off the top of my head. Precious
Precious
Auntie.
Auntie. Yeah.
Precious Auntie. And unbeknownst to her, Precious Auntie is actually her mom. So her mom has become the nanny for her own child to her in-laws. The in-laws did not want her to marry their son. This other person wanted to marry her. She ends up trying to marry the man she wants, and the man that couldn't have her, like, sends, I can't remember if he comes himself or he sends his men, but there's this huge violent altercation. The man she wants to marry is killed. And so her daughter is basically taken over, and she can be there, but only as the nursemaid. And then the big plan is that the family wants to make money by marrying the daughter to that man who had murdered her father, but the daughter doesn't know, of course. And so Precious Auntie is in such a position, she can't speak literally because of the injuries she sustained in the attack that killed her husband to be. And her daughter won't listen to a word she says about how she shouldn't marry this abusive, terrible man. And so she finally decides that her in order to tell everybody how she truly feels and to make her daughter understand, she ends up committing suicide in this really violent, horrific way, basically saying, like, now that I've done this, I'm going to, like, haunt you guys, like, if you continue to do things against my wishes. And then later the child finds out that Precious Auntie was actually her mom, and she's kind of tormented by that the rest of her life. But, my students always talk about that figure in The Bone Setter's Daughter and the mother at the beginning of Maxine Hung Kingston's Woman Warrior, and how you have these women who, for various reasons, because of violence, domestic violence, or in the Woman Warrior rape, find themselves in these positions with daughters, have no voice, are being abused and taken advantage of, and they decide to kill themselves, because if they kill themselves, that will shame, terrify, like, have some sort of vengeance upon these people who have not necessarily been paying attention to them. And then these ghost type figures kind of help transmit this history that was being completely ignored or controlled before. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we necessarily think of Amy Tan as like a horror writer, but I do think there are horrific aspects in that picture of that treatment of that particular of those women.
I'm wondering, as listening to you recount what happened in The Bone Setter's Daughter, and I agree with you, that does not spoil it at all.
There's a whole lot
the-
after that.
yeah, there's a whole lot going on in that book that you just need to kind of read and unfold. And honestly, I think maybe a little foreknowledge of the plot would help with a reading of the book, because there is a lot to go through. But the idea here of not only, I mean, you have, which is, I think, pretty common for a traditional ghost story, is you have somebody who's been, and we talked about this, who's been marginalized, who is frustrated because they're not being heard. In this case, you have, a literal mute woman who cannot speak, who cannot, and I think at one point she even tries to write a letter that the daughter doesn't read, so every attempt to communicate is thwarted, which is frustrating enough. And it had she just kind of grown old and died and become a ghost, that would have been a pretty traditional ghost story there, like she died of a broken heart or something like that. But in this case, and I think this is what makes it, I mean, such a compelling read, but also in my mind firmly plants it in the horror genre, is that this ghost, like you said, is so vengeful, but that she actually kills herself with the intent of becoming a ghost. Which, Maxine Hong Kingston plays around with the idea of deliberate death, and that death bringing shame and on the family, and very similar things in The Woman Warrior. But I don't know. I can't think of any other in books or even in horror movies where somebody died with the intent of becoming a vengeful ghost. Because that's a really cool storyline just on its own.
I feel like there are more examples, but I'm blanking. But it is, I mean, it's an example of like seeking, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an example of like seeking power in whatever way you can. I mean, Maxine Hong Kingston has a narrator describe that when the woman kills herself in order so that she and her child will become ghosts, and also to poison the town's water supply, because there's a practical reason there too. What is it? She says like some mother, who was it? Loving mothers will take their children along or something like that. And so this idea of she can only, at least in The Woman Warrior, it's the idea that she can only kind of be a loving mother to her child and be connected to her child if she and the child die and become ghosts, which, yeah, I mean, and then of course she has the vengeance of them not being able to drink the water, and in addition to the shame too. It's an interesting response to a society that has that is pictured as having such intense control over the woman's whole life, mind, and body, that you just kind of like take the body out of the equation and exist on some other plane.
I have forgotten in the Kingston book that she had killed herself with the intention of poisoning the well water.
Yeah, there's two things going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Because she, like you said, it was that one last act of power of, I'm gonna make you unforgettable. I'm gonna make myself unforgettable by doing this act, by asserting myself in this way.
Right. I mean, even though they may still seek vengeance on that person by not giving them the proper respect after they've died, it's still like, you are always going to remember me. Everybody in your town is going to remember me. Everybody's going to know what the situation was. So yeah, I mean, it's very much like it's very much kind of a rebellion against the situation. I mean, unfortunately it ends in death, so it's hard to say, like, I don't know. It's a picture, like I said earlier, I think it's a picture of when, if that's your last resort, is to do something like that. Another aspect I think about these ghosts is that Amy Tan does this, Kingston does this, Morrison does this in several of her books. Native American writers like Louise Erdrich, Susan Powers does this. Gloria Naylor does this. This idea of two types of haunting. So you can have a really negative or terrifying haunting, like the mother's haunted by Precious Auntie because of the horrible things that happened there, and the fact that she just ignored her and threw her letter away, and various other, I mean, she was pretty terrible to this woman who was actually her mother and trying to protect her, and she has to deal with that. But there's also this idea of like this negative haunting of the main character in Amy Tan's book. So the woman in contemporary time is trying to deal with her mother who has dementia, who is terrified by this Precious Auntie character. And it starts out negative because she has these dreams about this Precious Auntie, even though she doesn't know anything about her. Her mom is so terrified of her. She's terrified of her. But as she gets older, she becomes more of like a beneficial ghost or whatever, because it forces her, because her mother doesn't remember because of her dementia, it forces her as a daughter to go find out more, to talk to people, to find photographs, to find information. And so she puts the puzzle together, and it ends up being like not as traumatic for her because she can pull that information in and it becomes part of her identity in a way that it that couldn't be for the mom because it was so raw. Like, we talked a lot about Beloved, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but Beloved does a similar thing there. She is a very negative and raw haunting, I guess, to all the people who experienced slavery. It is a very like vengefulness, reckoning idea going on with Beloved. But Setha's daughter Denver doesn't understand anything about what happened to her mom because her mom refuses to tell her anything. She doesn't know why her mom killed her sister. She doesn't know why her mom hurt her and tried to kill her brother. She doesn't know why her brothers are scared of her mom. She doesn't understand anything about her life, like prior to her like consciousness as a person. And Beloved coming back and haunting her mom allows Denver to hear the conversations between the two of them and to start talking to people and start trying to figure out what happened. And so in those books in particular, and there's a book about Kathleen Brogan's Cultural Haunting. There's a really interesting book on this, listeners, if you're interested. It is on the academic side, but it's really fascinating look at how people can be haunted in negative ways, but then when that haunting gets pushed on to generations in the future, it can then be turned around to be a beneficial thing where you learn what was held away from you, or you learn what was changed or ignored. It's almost like a way, like we were saying earlier, if your history has been taken away from you, you just create it through a ghost story because you're haunted by it. And then the next generation can learn that history through being haunted. So I don't know if that's necessarily like a horror aspect per se, but this idea of like when you don't know what the ghost means, it's a lot more terrifying than once you realize it, because then you can learn something about why you're being haunted.
Well, I mean, just to bring it to the, I guess, non-academic side, but what you were just explaining, and I have not read that book, Cultural Hauntings, but I want to. That sounds right up my alley. I mean, isn't that the premise of most ghost stories that we get as horror movies? I mean, I think back to The Ring, which scared me ridiculously. I mean, I know that one technically has like a murderous videotape or whatever it was, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wasn't that the whole point? Is once you knew about the ghost, then the only way to stop it was to basically tell the story of what happened, right? Because it
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, I haven't seen it in a long time, and I know that there were sequels, and so I'm pretty sure that all of that gets undone. That it's not just as simple as like finding, but wasn't oh gosh, it has been forever since I've seen that movie, but it was something along those lines where it was like it was a hidden history of abuse and neglect, and really the only way out of the haunting was to talk about it, to spread the story, to let other people know. So it was that idea of a history that had been hidden, and the kind of antidote to the haunting was telling the story, which
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to be, I felt like I was going to be glib by bringing it up, but I was thinking of The Sixth Sense when you were talking, Mel. But I think The Ring is a much better analogy because it does have that part of the story that involves continuing to spread the history of it. But I mean, the same sort of thing happens in The Sixth Sense. The ghosts become they don't frighten the kid anymore once he actually begins interrogating them and speaking to them and actually finding out why, what it is they're wanting, so to speak. But again, yeah, I think for the purpose of this episode, I like The Ring better. So thanks, Lisa. That's a really good analogy.
thanks. I hadn't thought about The Sixth Sense in that way either, but you're right. Of course, I wonder what that means then for a ghost, because we kind of gestured to The Sixth Sense in another episode, and when we talked about the others, I think. But what you do with these stories that have ghosts that are unaware of what happened, and that's kind of what is keeping them locked in their own ghost story too, which kind of fits. And I may be really stretching here, but it kind of fits with this idea, Mel, because you talked about it really briefly, but with the Bone Setter's daughter, the fact that you have a character who has dementia, who's almost becoming a ghost in and of herself, because kind of trapped in that place where you don't fully know what happened. I don't know. There's something there connecting all of them, but I have not thought through quite what that is yet.
No, I mean, a lot of ghost stories. I'm sitting here thinking, like, there's a lot of ghost stories, or particularly narratives with like mediums, where the whole idea is of gaining knowledge. Like once you learn from the ghost what it wanted or what happened to it, then it can go away, right? Like the unfinished business. Or once the ghost learns that, oh, I'm a ghost, then you can figure out what's going on in the afterlife. And then there's the haunting ghost stories that are ambiguous at the end, where we just don't know, period. But yeah, the more I'm thinking about this, the more I'm thinking that a lot of ghost stories, in the end, there's some sort of knowledge that's uncovered. And I think, going back to your quote from Colin Dickey's book, history is a very ghostly thing, because it's something that happened and is past, but there's still traces of it, and it makes us who we are. If we forget if we have dementia, we forget our personal history or whatever, we're losing our identity. We're basically becoming a ghost. I think there's something about ghosts and hauntings being intricately tied up in this idea of what happened in the past, and we either try to repress it and we bust it, or we don't want to deal with it, or we deal with it and then we have some sort of like, we learn something, we act in a different way, we have new connections, we think about things differently. So I don't know. I'm starting to think it's more the reaction of the person who's being haunted that decides what kind of a ghost story it's going to be.
Well, now I'm wondering where to put something like, because I know we talked about this before, but Carmen Maria Machado's Especially Heinous, where you have the ghosts that are demanding that their, stories be told, and they're demanding that they be heard, but telling the stories doesn't do anything in that case. It just devolves into a really terrifying, chaotic, where the people being haunted are literally being driven crazy. So I don't know. I mean, I can see where there's the history of the ghosts that, like you said, that need to be heard, and the history that needs to be prodded. But then, when you look at some of the more contemporary stories, that's not always the case. And maybe that's just because we haven't had the time removed from it yet.
Yeah,
when you're talking about generational things. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just thinking, Especially Heinous is just like real. The Machado story, Especially Heinous, is really contemporary. I mean, it's a takeoff. It's like a parody of Law and Order SVU, which is a very interesting way of formatting the story. But then it's about really disturbing, terrible things, like you said. It's kind of terrifying chaos where identity devolves, and I mean, you just don't. It's this postmodern chaos where you don't know what's going on as things get deteriorate. But yeah, it's not a multi-generational history. I mean, the ghosts that are haunting the woman detective are women and children who have been murdered, and their crimes haven't been solved. And so you have them going to say, find a woman's body, and they're just like, oh, this person must have been a prostitute or whatever. There's like this basically pile of file folders of people's murders that just aren't being solved. And the male detective's realization about the horrible aspect of sexual assault in all of these cases as well. It's very intense, and it's very contemporaneous, and it's very, I think it's an idea of vengefulness too. Like, the victims who are haunting the woman detective are haunting her because their case files are still open and she's not solving the mysteries fast enough. And they're like, they have the bells, her eyes are ringing the bells, and they're keeping her up at night because they tell her she needs to work 24 hours, and they keep saying, give us voices, give us voices. This idea that they weren't protected or paid attention to or seen as fully fledged individuals alive, and they're not seen that way when the detectives are investigating their deaths and their mysteries aren't solved. And if I remember right, I reread this last week, but there's this one point where the detective is actually begging them to let her sleep, and she's like, don't you need sleep? And they're like, no, we don't need sleep. We never got to sleep while we were alive, but we never sleep now. And I think they say something like, we pursue justice at all hours or something. And I mean, that's an intense picture of a ghost right there. I mean, vengeful, wanting to tell your story to whoever will listen. And it's like a 24-hour a day, like, we don't need to sleep, eat, nothing. We're trying to assert ourselves and get some sort of voice here.
I love that story. But it is interesting comparing that, because we started off with Amy Tan and Toni Morrison, and like you said, that those were these multi-generational stories. And even with something like, okay, Toni Morrison is writing about slavery many, many, many years later. And even though it's something that I don't think our culture has moved on from, it's something that she can look at it from a point of remove. And it's the same thing with The Bone Setter's Daughter, because even the structure of that, you have a daughter who's living and working in America and really doesn't fully understand the world that her mother and her grandmother grew up in. And that's part of trying to, reach across and make that bridge so that they understand each other. And that's where the ghosts come in, and but it is so much different in the especially heinous story and some of the ghost stories that are being written today that take place today, because I think part of the thing that made those ghosts so frightening and especially heinous, the ones that, like you said, they're just relentless, they won't sleep, is because you can feel their frustration, not only for everything you just went through, but the fact that it keeps happening, that we know that there's a problem and it just keeps happening over and over and over again. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes from. And I don't want to, switch too far, but that does remind me a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it up, of the novel White Tears. I don't know if you've read that. It's by, and I think I'm saying his name right, Hari Kunzru. It reminds me a lot of kind of the same type of haunting that really doesn't have it really can't be solved, if that makes sense. And I'll give you an overview. It's a relatively new book. I don't want to spoil it. I promise you this does not spoil it, because it just doesn't. But it takes, basically the premise of it is there are two like college age boys in their 20s or something in New York City, and one of them's name is Carter, and he is this like trust fund kid, which doesn't that just sound like it, Carter? But he just has money and privilege, and he makes friends with this guy named Seth, who is not quite as wealthy as he is, but is still doing okay. And they both share a mutual obsession with African American music, in particular, like blues music of like the 20s and 30s. And they decide that they're going to start their own record label and kind of make the old gritty sounding blues records. Of course, this is in New York City, keep in mind, and with two young white boys doing this. And Seth is walking around the city kind of collecting ambient noise on a recorder, and he gets this snippet of what sounds like an old blues song, and he takes it back to the studio, and he shares it with his friend, and they decide that they're gonna kind of dirty it up and make it sound old, and they put it out as this, we found this old recording, and they put it out there. And of course people start listening to it on the internet saying, oh, this is amazing, this is great. But basically what ends up happening is a really terrifying haunting of this kid. And it's all tied to this recording that he has. He eventually, tries to travel down south to try to like solve it. Again, I'm not spoiling anything in the book, so you can still read it with full, fully enjoying it. But it's really interesting because it deals a lot with cultural appropriation, which is something that I think people are cautious to talk about in general, but when you put it in the context of a ghost story, it's something that becomes much easier to talk about. But it's really interesting because, like the way somebody like Machado deals with ghosts, there's not going to be if you just uncover the story that's happening here, the ghost will go away, or we'll have some sort of happy ending because I'll have a greater understanding of what somebody else went through. It's just a really kind of terrifying, relentless look at what happens when somebody goes somewhere that they really don't belong and they take something that doesn't belong to them. It's really, really fascinating, and I highly recommend that if anything we've talked about today um, sounds really interesting to you, then read White Tears, because it's one of the most interesting ghost stories. I mean, it's shocking, it's unsettling, unsettling is really the best word I can describe it. It's really interesting. I'll leave it at that. Have you read it, Mel?
I have not, but when it came out, I heard about it on a podcast I was listening to, and I was like, I need to check that out. So it has always been on my radar. I just haven't gotten to it. And like most books that you bring up on the podcast I haven't read, I now need to go dig it up and put it on the top of my to be read pile, because it sounds amazing and really appropriate, I think, to kind of enter into
Well,
that debate.
I think Mississippi even makes an appearance in it because of the whole like blues and crossroads. Anyway,
Mhm.
Matt, have you checked out White Tears? Because I really especially think you would like it.
No, unfortunately, I haven't read that, but it is on my list now, so I'm going to change that very soon.
Yeah, I think you'll really enjoy it. I really do. So you'll
It
have to let me
sounds
know when you do read it.
it sounds really good, and yes, I will definitely definitely update you on it, because that sounds like right up my alley of interests there.
Well, Mel, I didn't mean to derail the Carmen Maria Machado discussion, but I just had to throw that in there about White Tears. Did you have anything else to add about Especially Heinous?
Oh, you don't have to apologize for throwing White Tears in there. It's very appropriate. When I saw it in the document, I was very happy that it was there. But I was thinking, when you were talking about White Tears and you were saying that it's like Machado's story that's really intense and terrifying, and there's no like sitting down and figuring out what's going on, then you learn something and move on. I think it's definitely that idea of multi-generational versus highly contemporaneous. But I'm wondering if there's also an aspect of, for example, I can't talk too much about White Tears, but I think this might work with that too. But especially Heinous, the problem in all of these books, systematic oppression is a problem. Like, you have actual societies like built on these aspects of ignoring certain people or belittling certain people's experience. But in the multi-generational books, you have multiple generations kind of working their way through this information, and you sometimes have people even changing countries that they're living in, cultures. In Machado's, especially Heinous, for example, the women and children who are yelling at the detective every night as she tries to sleep, saying, "Why are you sleeping and eating? Why aren't you working on solving our mysteries?" I feel like they've almost become this like Greek chorus of furies. It's they want their deaths to be solved, but they also just want her to fix the broken and systemic racism and oppression that has caused the situation to happen. And I think that's partially why she finds it so overwhelming, and it becomes just like it takes over her and her partner's entire lives to the point where they almost become like parallel universe versions of themselves, because the world itself and the society itself is broken. So she can't learn anything from these women and children because nobody was paying attention to them. The society is broken, and they're like, "You're a police officer, fix the society." And I think there's this immediacy and this pain to that. And I feel like White Tears might be verging on that same thing too, that there is this larger problem. And we need this kind of jolting, terrifying, ghostly experience in order to show that this is a problem. Does that make sense?
Oh no, absolutely, and it fits. It does fit White Tears. Yeah, absolutely, because it's not just a kind of it's not a cursed object story. It's not, well, these two kids are unique in that they went out and stole something that did not belong to them and took it and made it their own. It is most definitely part of this is something that is, as you said, is systemic and keeps happening and continues to happen, and nobody is addressing it. And I think the fact that he could take that kind of subject and make it so, and Machado does it too, make it so terrifying, kind of speaks to it. And it does exactly, kind of to take it back to the beginning, it does what that Dickey quote from Ghostland does, where it tries, ghosts are there in part to give word to that which we don't understand. So it's something that we have not fully processed as a culture or as a society. We cannot deal with something that we have not acknowledged. We can't deal with something that we have not processed. So how do we begin to talk about something that we can't, that we can't put words to yet? Well, enter in these kind of contemporary ghost stories that allow us to do exactly that. I could continue to talk about white tears for a while, and I certainly could continue to talk about Carmen Maria Machado. Just as a side note, I have not read her newest book. What is it? In the Dream House? I think that's the title. It's a memoir. Well, I've heard it's memoir-ish. She kind of tells about her life and through some interesting storytelling techniques. But I can't wait to read that one. So I'll throw that as a little side note out there. But this is just a reminder as we wrap this up that Mel and I wrote a nonfiction book. In it, we do talk about some of the women who wrote ghost stories from, starting back 100 years ago or so up to the present. So if this is something that is interesting to you, you might want to go pick it up. It's called Monster She Wrote. You can get your copy by going to Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. Of course, you can go to your local bookstore and request it, and we would love that too. If you liked what you heard in this episode or this episode series on ghosts, then we would love to hear from you. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we've been getting some really interesting emails from our listeners lately, and that is so exciting because I love to hear what you have been reading and watching that you kind of thought of as we were talking about all this stuff. That's very exciting to us. But please drop us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. We try to respond to all of those. We've been getting a little busy with the holidays lately, but we hope to get caught up soon. Of course, if you love what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You get access to exclusive content when you do that, or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. As always, thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.